My name is Morndaz, and welcome back to The Prince and the Paper, where I stand here, talk about books, and try to validate my English degree. This month, we're celebrating the Ides of March with a killer analysis of William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. You guys know how I feel about using SparkNotes in place of actually doing the reading, but when it comes to the Bard, they've actually got a great tool called No Fear Shakespeare that lets you read the whole play with the original text on one side and a modern translation on the other. Again, don't substitute the modern translation for the real thing, but if you have trouble understanding the language of Shakespeare's time, which is called Early Modern English, by the way, not Old English, or even Middle English, then have the No Fear version open as you read. It's much better to use a tool like this as opposed to reading the play and not understanding a word of it. Professor, what's a hag seed? But whatever you do, do not read this play for historical accuracy, because our friend Shakespeare definitely pulled some of these details right out of his pantaloons. Julius Caesar takes place in ancient Rome around the year 44 BC. If you paid attention in history class, or even if you didn't, you know that Rome was once the seat of a huge empire. You know, the Roman Empire? Understanding how the government worked during this time is pretty important to understanding why the characters in this play do what they do. You've probably heard the term republic before, and that's because the Romans established it as a system of government almost 500 years before the events of Julius Caesar. The republic was designed to prevent one person from having all the power, like in a monarchy. The three parts of the Roman government were the Senate, the consuls, and the assemblies. The Senate was made up of 300 seats, filled by the wealthiest people in Rome, handpicked by the consuls, two government officials who were elected anew each year and shared the head of the government. The assemblies were, as you can probably guess, the common people of Rome, or plebeians. It was their right as citizens to assemble in the forum and vote. Of course, the word citizen didn't constitute every person who called themselves Roman. The assemblies could easily have their votes overruled or vetoed by the Senate, but they did get to select which two members of the Senate served as consuls for that year. So in theory, by electing consuls who are more sympathetic to the needs of the common people, they could gradually gain more political power. It was this system of government that was in place during the events of the play, and it was the perceived threat to this system that led to Caesar's downfall. Shakespeare plays are always chock full of characters. Why are there so many Antonios? I'm not going to identify the protagonist of Julius Caesar, because when it comes to Shakespeare, it can be really difficult to identify who the protagonist is. It's more like the main cast and the supporting cast. The main cast of this story includes Brutus, Antony, and Caesar, of course. Brutus is a Roman politician. He's honorable, steadfast, and arguably the most morally upright of the main cast, and probably the supporting cast. I say this because while Antony and co want to destroy Caesar for their own gain, Brutus is the only one who truly believes that doing so would actually benefit Rome. We've got a government full of dudes whose ambition is entirely egocentric, but Brutus's honor is staked in his loyalty to Rome and its people. However, it's this kind of rigid loyalty that makes it really easy for the rest of the cast to manipulate him. As you're reading, watch out for the ways in which Brutus's commitment to principle shapes the play's conclusion. Brutus is what we would call a tragic hero. He is the epitome of what Roman virtue was supposed to be, which is why Antony calls him the noblest Roman of them all. Antony, not so much. He's your textbook example of a corrupt politician. All he's missing is a comb-over. He's skilled with rhetoric in ways that Brutus isn't, and finds it easy to manipulate much of the cast into turning on Caesar. It's like he knows exactly how to behave in every situation in order to gain political leverage, and unlike Brutus, his public persona and private affairs are closely linked. As readers, we might look at him and think, how could anybody follow this jerk? But if Antony was running in the 2020 election, well, you saw what happened last time. Last but deceased is this play's namesake, Julius Caesar. This is a guy who wants to go down in history, and after being stabbed 23 times, he certainly does. Antony, Brutus, and the other conspirators see Caesar as a leader with too much ambition, which, as we all know, can only have one possible conclusion. Caesar's behavior does seem to substantiate this claim. Despite many supernatural warnings, he just can't seem to resist the crown when it's offered to him. He ignores the warnings because he largely in part sees himself as immortal, as in his legacy will live on forever. His mistake was thinking that this sort of immortality also applied to his very fleshy and corporeal body. Is this hubris? Ironically, even though Caesar holds the highest position of political power, he isn't the best politician in the play. Methinks Shakespeare was onto something. However, Brutus does credit their misfortunes to Caesar's power plaguing them from beyond the grave, so who's to say? Although these three politicians are at the center of the play, don't forget to pay attention to characters like Cassius, Octavius, and Casca. Even pawns can determine the outcome of a chess game. In typical Shakespeare fashion, this play is wildly political, so it's no surprise that the primary theme of Julius Caesar is ambition. We see this theme manifest itself in different ways throughout the course of the play, and it looks different between each of the characters. Caesar's ambition is rooted in his desire to live on in the minds of mankind forever. He defers to the crown because he sees it as a clear-cut path to achieving this. Antony's ambition is fixed on his thirst for political power, which is similar to Caesar's but not quite the same. As I said earlier, Antony keeps his political and private selves connected. His every move is set in the direction of deposing Caesar and taking power. Brutus is the only character whose ambition isn't entirely based on personal gain. He is ambitious in the sense that he would do whatever it takes to uphold Roman virtue, even if it means conspiring against Caesar.
We should totally just stab Caesar!
However, note that even though these characters had different sources of ambition, none of them really ended up getting quite what they wanted. In writing Julius Caesar, Shakespeare imparts a clear warning. Through the fates of these characters, he demonstrates that while ambition can be useful, too much of it can only lead to disaster. You know what they say, with great ambition comes great tragedy. Just ask Macbeth. Julius Caesar also rolls with the themes of fate versus free will, identities, and the power of language, all of which are connected in some way to the themes of ambition and political power. In Julius Caesar, symbols take the form of supernatural omens.
This'll scare him.
Spooky. We see them show up several times, from the soothsayer's warnings to Calpurnia's dreams to weird occurrences in nature. Of course, omens are rarely clear, so all of these symbols are subject to interpretation. First, Shakespeare uses storm imagery to symbolize approaching conflict. Some of the characters even interpret this as divine anger, which ties the theme of religion into the play. The general rule of thumb in Shakespeare plays is, if there's thunder and lightning, hold on to your knickers. Animals and insects are also used as symbols of ill omen, just like in real life. Birds are a pretty prominent one, specifically dark birds such as crows and ravens, which are pretty famous symbols for death. Both Calpurnia and Casca also have dreams involving lions, which is a nod to Cassius saying that Caesar is the lion in the Capitol. Don't hit us over the head or anything, Will. And finally, we see symbols of ill omen in the form of ghosts, another pretty common Shakespeare thing. Just ask Macbeth. First, Casca encounters a group of women who claim to have had visions of men in flames, a pretty clear sign of bad news. Later on, Brutus is visited by a ghost who he believes to be Caesar. In classic literary form, the appearance of the ghost is meant to stir the conscience of the person to whom the ghost has appeared. Is this where Dickens got the idea for A Christmas Carol? We could talk about that in December. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts, agreements, disagreements, and interpretations of Caesar. And if you have a question about something that I didn't talk about, drop it in the comments below or feel free to find me on Twitter. I'm Morndaz, and this has been The Prince and the Paper. See you next time!
Oh.
It too, Chirby.
Oh.